So good morning to all of you. Today's session we are going to cover effective customer communication skills. So it's in short, it is building up on yesterday's session. Yesterday's session we covered the broad frameworks. We covered email, we covered social media, we covered telephonic conversation. Today we will take that as our reference framework, and we will then look at some guidelines on how do you effectively put forth your thoughts via all these mediums. Right? Some of it we touched yesterday, but this will go much deeper. It will also get into some psychological traits. Why do we have to do it this way? So there are studies done, and there are people who take this as a subject and study and do research, do PhDs, right? So we are going to derive from that and then create some guideline and a framework using which you can become an effective communicator. So my goal is I'm going to use the deck as a reference. I will try to bring in some personal examples about my journey through this period, how bad I was as a communicator, and hopefully what you see today is a far revised version of me. Okay. That part I'm going to weave it through the session. Okay. As we touch upon certain topics, I'll try to bring those in. So these are the objectives. There is going to be one slide and there is a follow-on slide. By the end of this session, you should be able to get into all of this. Key components of effective communication. Some do's and don'ts like face-to-face, what you should do. Telephone, what is the behavior, what is the discipline that you should follow. Written communication. To a great extent, we touched upon this yesterday, so let's reinforce that. The other thing is feedback. Did I really make an impact? Right? Did my thinking process, my thought process, my communication idea I had in mind, did that reach the recipient? The recipient could be a customer, could be a vendor, could be a colleague. Right? Did that really happen? So we'll see how to do that. So these are the methods. What does it entail? We are going to talk about face-to-face, telephone, written, and the last part, was the communication effective? Now, there is a big challenge today, and you will observe people in general can be categorized into two categories, right? Broad categories, introverts and extroverts. There are, of course, a lot of shades in between, but in general, broad category is introvert and extroverts. And today, what's happening is social media is also turning a lot of introverts into extroverts. Because of what I described yesterday, social media gives you this feeling, this great feeling and power that I have my little private space, and in that private space I can do anything, right? So that it is healthy. It is healthy in the sense it allows a lot of people who otherwise would find it very difficult to communicate, stand in front of an audience and talk. But when they're abstracted from the physical conversation, when they're hidden behind a virtual medium, they freely open up, and then they very freely share thoughts. So that is the power of what social media has done. The downside of that is it has become conversation and conversation and conversations. Right? Nobody today seems to have the time and patience to listen. So we'll see why that is important. So communication here, as described here, is the art of transmitting information, ideas and attitudes from one person to another. So when I'm standing here and when I'm talking to you, when I'm doing this session, my goal, going by this guideline and definition, is that what I have planned for this session, I should be able to gauge, effectively communicate that to you, get feedback, looking at you, asking questions to see if I have done the right thing, if you have been able to grasp. Right? Now here is a contained session with a structure, with a plan, with a well-defined PPT backing me. But when you go to a meeting, when you go to a customer meeting, sometimes it's a mixture of formal and informal communication. So you really have to figure out how to streamline all this, build upon the session. Right? And that is not easy. There is a lot of art involved in it. It's not apparent, and you can very easily get distracted. So if you're conscious about all of this methods that is going to come across in this PPT or presentation is going to talk about how do you get that in the given time frame when you have these meetings, when you have conversations, how do you make it most effective? So what is effective communication? There is this misnomer in most people that communication, my job is over. If I have an agenda and if I have some thoughts, if I may have written it down, I go and stand in front of an audience and I just deliver it. That's the classic classroom format. If you go to a school today, even if you go to a college today, in general what happens is the lecturer comes with some prepared notes, right? They stand like this, 90 students sitting in the class, nobody cares whether anybody understood or not. You just come, do your job, deliver the session, get paid, walk out. Correct? In general. There are of course good professors, good teachers, good exceptions. So that's the standard mode. If you go to a political forum and listen to people speaking, they are of course great communicators. Most of them, they are very street smart. They build upon your ideas and thoughts, but the goal, objective still, you come with a very planned agenda and you somehow plant that into the listener's head. Now, I'm not saying it is bad communication, but the kind of work we do, the kind of interactions we want to have, that is not the right way to communicate. You have to engage the audience. You have to make sure that it is a two-way communication. Okay? So that's what is being described here. Communication has to be two-way. A major part of your communication has to be listening. If you don't listen, there is no way you will be able to fine-tune your thoughts using which you can deliver the next phrase or sentence in a better way. Correct? So that active listening is extremely important. Feedback is that way. Feedback happens through body language, through gestures, and it takes time to train, learn, observe, and understand that. It has to be clear. Now, this is very important, and I think some of the slides later also describe that. And let me bring in a little personal example of how difficult it was for me. I was a born introvert. I grew up as an introvert. I would say through school, through college, through my initial years of job, I would just contain to myself, right? I mean, it was my own little world, little space. So great lot of ideas and thoughts going in my head, but when I go and come and speak in front of an audience, all these thoughts come in random fashion, right? So for the listener, they just cannot connect it together. It took me a long time to understand where was I having problem. Then I realized that, and this happens with most technical people, the way you think is very random. Observe yourself when you speak. Right? Observe yourself. So what happens is in that 5, 10, 15 minutes when you converse with somebody, in that 15 minutes, most likely all of the ideas would have come. But it has not come in the sequence in which the recipient wants it, the listener wants it. So thought sequencing is a very difficult process which you have to consciously work on. Thought sequencing means that your sentence has to be constructed in your mind a little ahead of when you're speaking. And then you have to figure out how to sequence it together so that it makes sense to the audience. Which is why people like Modi are extremely good. They're extremely good communicators. Of course, in the last one, there is this controversy that we're using teleprompters, which are very transparent, right? But otherwise, if you look at the way he communicates, I'm sure there is a lot of preparation done in the background. There are script writers and all of that. The way he comes and presents it and builds upon it. I've very, very rarely seen people do it these days. So that is the power. And today, Modi's power is all communication. Right? So many people like that. I can take many examples. But he's, in my opinion, one of the extremely good communicators that I have seen. And it is because he would have worked on it. He hasn't gone and formally took people say he has gone to a college and did his degree and all that. But I'm very sure whatever you see him delivering today is because he has consciously worked on it and figured out a way to connect with the audience, sequence the thought, build upon the audience, and then deliver. And that is something which you should consciously work on and understand. It is something very difficult if you are inherently an introvert. So unless you consciously work on it, it's difficult. So a lot of people, if you observe, when you go to a meeting or a forum, not meeting, okay, at least when you go to a place where you, let's say a workshop. So people who are not comfortable doing that or not confident doing that, they will come with a prepared script. Right? They will keep it somewhere because you still have to look at the camera, look at the audience. That is what's typically done. If you remember Manmohan Singh, he never gave an extempore speech. It was always written down. He was a great learned scholar, but a very bad communicator. So for those people, the only way is you have to script it. Write it down, keep it with you so that you don't deviate from the script. Which is not the right way to do when you are engaged with customers. You have to figure out how to use that meeting, how to build upon the session, and then how do you effectively deliver. So just again summing it up graphically, key goals would be it's a mutual exchange, right? So you are giving some information, you're getting some information, and then slowly sequencing it and building the conversation. Persuasion. Why is persuasion important? Because typically you have to negotiate. If you're in a business meeting, let's say you have a product in which you have developed, it may not be fully complete. You're trying to figure out if this is the right product to be done, or you're trying to figure out if your vendor or your partner wants to engage with you and take it together to the market. So it is some form of selling. But the word selling is not being used here because selling is a different form of positioning your product. Persuasion is where you are trying to convey to the listener, to whoever is your partner, that there is a power in what you have. And that power could be an idea, that power could be a product, the power could be some content of your brochure. But unless you do that effectively, the recipient will not engage. Is that clear? Is that complex? Idea, see, you are taking an idea, or you're taking a product, you're taking a brochure. You want to stress that this is something useful. Okay? The usefulness could be commercial value, the usefulness could be social value, usefulness could be how do I engage with this partner so that we can jointly do something. The partner is not aware of what you've done. So that is why persuasion is important. Understanding and then action and changing behavior. Now, understanding and action is again derived from these. So you do a bilateral or two-way communication and effectively mold your conversation so that eventually it leads to an action. Right? Otherwise, you will keep going to meetings after meetings after meeting and nothing will come out of it. Something has to converge. That's also very important, and I think it's very important that you understand that you shouldn't be wasting your time. If you go to a customer or client, whoever, it could be a vendor, or if you may be selling your home division products, customer may show initial interest, you will go first meeting, second meeting, and then you have to sense, is this going to go anywhere? If it is not going to go anywhere, the customer may not tell you directly. You should be able to gauge, because otherwise it's a big waste of time. And it's better to drop that and move on to somewhere else. Otherwise, you will keep repeating the same thing, believing that my product or my idea is great, without getting any traction from the other end. And what I'm saying here is true even when you're talking to your manager. It has nothing to do with just selling a product. Even when you go with something to a manager, it could be your personal issues, it could be your ideas, could be some real constraints that you are in. Right? If you don't use that, then it's very difficult to get the buy-in from the other end. Behavioral change is required when, maybe this is a classic case where you have a manager and an employee, you're finding some issues, you want to help change behavior, so that is one aspect of it. The other aspect could be that you want to change some market behavior. So market behavior is a little complex, let's not get there. That's a social change. But if you want to do a behavioral change with your employee, with your team, then there has to be methods. And a lot of times it's not easy because people have compartmentalized ways of thinking. Right? And so, unless you put forth the messaging in the right manner and ensure that it really doesn't cause, it is getting a buy-in. It's just like selling a product. Right? So you're taking an idea, you want to change behavior in a certain way so that effectively you are becoming more productive. In that sense, there could be natural resistance, so you have to figure out how do you change that resistance? How do you ensure that adoption happens to the idea that you're taking? That is where the behavioral change comes. Emotions play a very critical role, right? And especially in verbal communication, telephonic communications, even in writings, your emotions can skew your communication. So it's extremely important that you are aware of that. And when you construct whichever form of communication, you have to keep that backdrop that if you are communicating and using a medium and the backdrop is your company, then that takes the first priority. So because it is an image of the company. So if you bring in a lot of your emotions, it can be again treated or construed as an emotion from the company's end. Okay. So that is something which you have to be very conscious about. The last one is fairly self-explanatory. If you start with a great communication way of starting the engagement, it can lead to long-lasting engagements. So most common ways to communicate, body language, writing, visual, image and speaking. If you look at most of the speakers outside of India, right, in general, they use their entire body, because I think there's a slide which talks about how much percentage of communication happens via gestures. Right? So it's a way to engage the audience, because when they see, it's like acting, right? So when you are an actor, how are you engaged with the actor? You're engaged with the actor because of emotions that are conveyed to you. Emotions can be conveyed through body language effectively. So that is the power of body language. Media claims that Modi is excellent at this. I'm going to repeatedly use Modi's example because they say Modi is excellent at this. But if you look at most of the good communicators outside of India, this is the first and foremost thing they'll emphasize. Body language, and we have some examples later on. But postures and how do you sit, what is the right posture to sit and engage with the customer. Speaking derives if you're standing like this, speaking to an audience, or if you are engaged in a meeting and if you're trying to converse, right? Post that, and then when you're doing that in a session like this, imagery and visuals form an important part. So why is that important? Because the general study says that if you do a session, how does the idea of that session stay implanted in your brain, right? So the most effective form for that, the highest absorption happens when you create visual imagery. Okay? So visual imagery is today created through forums, medias like these. So I can have a PPT, I can have a film, I can have some animations going on. Those are one form, right? One form which technology enables. The best form of visual imagery is way beyond this. It is storytelling. So if you want to be the highest form of communicator, these can only be aids. You have to bring in connecting stories. It is that grandma impact. If you remember, I'm very sure most of you would remember all those old stories that your grandma told. And if you really go and analyze, those stories were not merely stories. There was a purpose behind that story. Right? The grandma wanted you to learn something. As a child, if she says, no, don't do this, do this, if you do this, you will be, here, you will not understand. So what is the best way to engage? You bring in a story. What does the story do? Story builds upon, there is a suspense element, there is some excitement, there are emotions. You build upon that and then slowly put this message in. Okay. So one thing I've seen in the last few years, when I go and speak to people, when I go and meet very old eminent professors, what I see is they don't need any of this. They do not need a PPT, they do not need a computer. They will just stand in a dais like this, they'll throw all this away, and they'll start building stories. By the end of that half an hour or 45-minute session, because of the way they're able to use the power of storytelling, everything is there in your head. So work on that. It's not difficult. You have to go back to your childhood, think about how grandmas told you stories, then you have to figure out how do you create stories. And bring in a lot of personal examples. If you do that, then I think you can become an excellent communicator. So that's what is summed up here. And in here, there's not talking about storytelling. Visual and imagery is essentially using tools like these, PPTs or videos or animation sequences. Body language is using your hands, facial expressions, looking at the audience and using the right phrases. Speaking, how do you choose the right phrases and right words?